Hi, I'm Peter Wheelhauer from Western Michigan University. Today we're going to be talking about a few topics related to consuming media and consuming it intelligently. We're first going to take a few minutes and look at media as a linkage institution in American society, connecting people in government with the public. And then we're going to look at four types of articles that we'll typically find pretty much no matter what kind of media you're looking at. So we'll take a few minutes and talk about media linkage, and then we're going to wrap up our whole conversation looking at how we can be better and more intelligent consumers of the media we use. So when we think about the role of the media or the press, the focus in the readings and the focus in a lot of our discussions are really about press institutions like journalistic outlets. It's not so much talking about media as in your social media on a personal basis, your Twitter or Instagram account. It's more talking about, what is the role of the press, newspapers, broadcast media, people who are supposed to be reporting the news, gathering information and putting that out in the public space. How does that work in the American political system? So historically, this is basically the way it has worked, at least over the last 100 years or so, that the media acts as a go-between, or what political scientists call a linkage institution. They are a go-between between politicians and government officials and the mass public. And the reason that it's a go-between is because it's a way that politicians have historically of getting the word out about what they want the public to know. So politicians historically have, when they have information to share, they send that information to a news media outlet, like a newspaper or a TV station or something like that, or a TV network. And then that TV network then is responsible for disseminating that information to the public. So the government officials then want to get the word out. So they then send information to the press, and the press then distributes that information to the people. But what happens in that process all the time is that the government officials, president, members of Congress, governors, whoever it happens to be, they have what they want the people to know. And then the reporters and the journalists then take what the government wants them to know, wants the people to know, and then decides whether that's worth knowing, and then maybe adds new information to it. So they do reporting to find out, why is this important? Are there alternative perspectives? And so the process then is one of the government officials sending the media what they want the media to tell the public, and then the media distills that information and then gives what they think is important to the public. It's also a way for the public to communicate with the government in maybe more efficient ways than writing letters or making phone calls or sending emails. So the public then, what's going on in the public's mind is transmitted through the media to government officials. So if the government has a particular policy that they want to pursue, like maybe aggressive fighting of climate change, right? So the government has a perspective they want the people to know about. They communicate that to the press communicates that to the public, and then the public then has a response to that. So we get that information and we think things about those policies about combating climate change. And so then that information from the public then gets gathered by the media and then communicated back to the government. So that the role of the media historically has been one of a communication between government officials and the public, and then between the public and government officials. And that's mostly the way it's worked for the last 100 years or so. But we know that Donald Trump does not like this process because he does not trust the filtering that the media does. He believes that they will take whatever he says and they will pick and choose what they like that will help them pursue some kind of a political agenda and make him look bad, and then communicate that to the public in order to manipulate the public. And so he calls that dissemination of information, what? Fake news, right? So Donald Trump's solution to that, which is kind of ingenious, but is clearly the way of the future, is that he goes around the press. right? So the purpose of his Twitter account is to avoid the sifting and interpreting that the media does. So he gets to tell the people, his millions of Twitter followers, directly, person to person, exactly what he's thinking about. So this is new, because we've always had presidents who we know, they're politicians, they're human beings, they have all these kinds of thoughts and feelings that all of you have about people that you like and don't like. It's just that now what's going on is that they would never, in the past, they would not necessarily communicate to the press, and even if it got out, then the press may or may not communicate that to the public. Donald Trump, you get exactly what he's thinking at any point in time, usually like 4 o'clock in the morning. You know exactly what he's thinking, who he's thinking about. So he goes around the press. And then what's interesting is then the press picks up that story and that tweet or that series of tweets, and then they try to communicate about his tweets. So Donald Trump then speaks directly to the public, which is a relatively new thing in American politics, because there has not been a vehicle for doing that on a widespread basis up until now. So he does this, goes around the media, and then what he then creates is he basically has control over what the media is going to talk about that day. Because especially with media that tends to be critical of Donald Trump, their day's agenda is set reacting to his morning tweets. So whatever he says early in the morning, the media picks up, and whatever they thought they were going to be talking about, then they are reacting to Donald Trump's tweets. And so this is completely a win-win for Donald Trump, because he gets his direct word out to the public, and then he gets the media talking about whatever he wants to talk about for the day. Instead of their coming up with their own ideas about what they think ought to be talked about, instead, he gets them to change their own agenda to talk about what he wants them to talk about. So there's kind of a genius in there in that manipulation of the media in a way that we have not seen. Presidents have always tried to manipulate the media. Every president does it. They try to make the media do what they want to do, talk about what they want to talk about. But it is just unprecedented that the president is able to do this in such a direct way. So that's new. This is one of the reasons the media hate Donald Trump, is because he talks directly to the people instead of using the filter of the media the way they've traditionally been used. Questions or thoughts about that? Okay. We're going to identify 4 main types of articles. So here's just a really brief introduction and summary of all the things we're going to look at. First of all, we're going to look at the fact that some articles that we see, and these, when I'm talking about articles, I could be talking about the way that a news show on cable television talks about an event that has occurred. So we're talking about not just an article that you can read, but it could also refer to the kinds of things that you see in a video format as well. So sometimes we are just looking at news, and sometimes we're going to look at the way that the information inside a true news story contains information that may or may not be truthful. Second, we're going to look at analysis stories. That is, that these are articles, or they could be audio or video interpretations of the news that we hear. So it's not just a matter of what happened, who, what, where, when, why. Analysis gets to why do these things occur generally? What do they mean? How can we understand them moving forward? Some articles are just sheer opinion. They're just trying to make a persuasive case that their position is right and why other positions are wrong. And then finally, we'll take a couple minutes and we'll look at satire. These are articles that are written to appear to be plausible or true, but in fact aren't really intended to be taken seriously. So then when you're consuming media, what are the kinds of articles that you're going to see when you go to a media for hard news? So there are 4 big categories of the kinds of articles that get published. So we're going to talk about those a little bit, each one. You can figure out most of those on your own, but it's worth kind of laying these out very clearly. So the first kind of article that we normally see is just news. But under the news, there are a bunch of different categories of news. So some news that you read in some kind of a media outlet or hear on a broadcast is true. So Robert Mueller released his report to the Trump administration on Friday. And a news story that communicates that is true. It gives you that actual information. Mueller delivers report on Trump-Russia investigation to the Attorney General. That's what the story is. It communicates that truthfully. But then within stories that are true, there may be problems with the statements that are in the articles or in those stories. So there may be stories that are true, but inside the true news stories are untrue statements. So part of the media's job is supposed to be telling us what's true about the true news, and maybe even debunking false things that are said. Oftentimes, you'll have quotations in true news stories. So if you go back almost any story over the last couple of years, and it's a story that's telling the truth about what happened, but then when people are asking politicians what they think about it, then the politicians will say untrue things, which will then get repeated in the article. So when Donald Trump or some other politician says something untrue on Twitter, for example, then the statement could get repeated in an article without its truthfulness being evaluated. So then we have to have the ability to read an article and then evaluate the truthfulness of statements that are within the articles, particularly quotations. Sometimes when we're looking at news, there are news stories that are factually untrue, that they actually say things that turn out to not be true. Now, in most media, most press outlets, this tends to be inadvertent, right? It's not that they intentionally said something false. It's that they reported something with information that when later information came out and turns out that was wrong. So, for example, after the Boston Marathon bombing, there were lots of news stories about how many people were involved and what the current danger was that turned out actually to be false, and that the media then had to go back and change and correct their answers. So sometimes responsible media outlets, when they publish information that is factually incorrect, they oftentimes will go back and correct it. So you can kind of tell the sign of a good journalistic outlet if they are upfront about the corrections that they make to mistakes that they made in previous stories. And then sometimes you get news that is just made up stuff. It's just not true, no matter who writes it. So the challenge is that Donald Trump, for example, and conservatives generally, they look at all these kinds of things and they categorize all of these things, these three bottom bullets, as fake news. But journalists will say the only things that are really fake news are things that are created intentionally wrong. That people are human, so sometimes you've got to make mistakes, but that can be corrected. The only things that are really technically fake news are things that are put together with the intention of looking right, but that the authors know are incorrect, know that they're wrong. So part of our job as consumers of news is to figure out and try to do some sorting about the difference between all these kinds of things that are true, things that are true but have false things in it, things that are just wrong that later get changed, and things that were intentionally created to be false. So one of the biggest stories in 2016 that turned out to be fake was this headline: Pope Francis endorsed Donald Trump for president. So this was done at a news site, WTOE 5 News, your local news station out of some obscure little town. This is on their website, and then this story got picked up by national media, and it's still going around, right? But as it turns out, this site, WTOE 5 News, is a fake news site. They just make stuff up, and they put it out there and see who will buy it. So it's one of these kind of things that we have to look out for this. And so this turned out to be the most forwarded and shared false news item in all of 2016. Right? So lots of people saw this, and the reason they saw this is and the reason they shared it so much is that the people were willing to believe it. Whatever things you had in your mind, your preconceived notions about this story could be reinforced, and it would reinforce those ideas. So people who hate Catholics, right, and they're prejudiced against Catholics, they would say, see, they're interfering in the United States election. And people who are against Donald Trump would say, see, this is trying to be too much religion in the politics. We don't like this. People who like Donald Trump say, see, even the Pope recognized Donald Trump. If it's good enough for the Pope, it must be good enough for... So all kinds of preconceived notions were reinforced by the story and got shared and forwarded more than any other story in 2016 that was a false news story. So part of what we have to figure out is, how can we tell the difference? Second major kind of article or product is analysis. So articles that are news are just reporting what happened. Analysis provides an overall context for making sense of what happened and talks about what it means, why it's important. So it's more than just saying Robert Mueller released his report. It's saying, here's what this means. Here's why it's important. Here's what you need to know about the context for this. Analysts are putting their own professional interpretation of the facts into the story. So they're asking you to trust them that they're interpreting things correctly and drawing things out correctly. But all analysts have their own biases. The question in an article is not whether the author has a bias. The question is, does the author acknowledge the bias? Does the author consider alternative interpretations that contradict theirs and give them a fair hearing? That's the kind of analysis that's actually quite helpful. It's not helpful for me to just read liberal stuff and think that that's right. Read a liberal interpretation of whatever and say that's right. Same thing conservative side. Just reading the conservative interpretation of something, conservative analysis, is not enough. So an example of an analysis is from this morning's New York Times, dealing with the Mueller report. And so there's a section in here, and this says, will the report be made public? So this is talking about forecasting the future. This is not news. Forecasting the future is not news. It's analysis. Answers about what might come next. Speculation. This is not news. This is experts looking at the whole thing and saying, all right, given all this, here's what we think is going on and what the future is going to hold. It's not just reporting. And it says here specifically, these reporters explain what the submission of the full report means and what may come next. When you see language like this, you know you're looking at analysis. You're not looking at reporting. Okay, so look at the language that's being used to help you understand the content of what you're reading. The third kind of article or product is opinion. In old media kinds of contexts, these are called op-ed pieces, opinion editorials. And basically, these are arguments. So it's not analysis about what it means and what's going to happen next. It's, I have a particular interpretation, and I'm going to marshal facts in support of my opinion to try to persuade you, my reader, that I'm right, that my interpretation is correct. So in this case, you can have a commentator like on the New York Times, and one of the things that's helpful about the New York Times is that when they're having opinion pieces, they label them opinion. That makes it really easy to say, okay, this is opinion. This is not reporting. It's not even analysis. It's this guy's opinion of how things are working. Sometimes opinion looks like analysis. So Vox.com, for example, has this section of their website called explainers. Okay, so that sounds like people who are going to provide analysis. But when you kind of dig down and you look at the actual articles, they're really opinion pieces that are used where they're drawing together a bunch of things to show why their perspective is right. And then sometimes it's very explicit, like on townhall.org, and you can tell exactly what it is that they're trying to do. So this top one here from Dennis Prager, his title of his piece says, "Assume the left lies, and you will discover the truth." There's no questioning where this guy's coming from, right? He's telling you in the headline, whatever the left is telling you, they're lying, right? So that tells you this is not necessarily going to be perfectly objective reporting and analysis. This is somebody trying to prove that he doesn't think that liberals can be trusted, right? So looking at the headlines, looking at the language that's used by the authors will help you to determine what kind of article it is that you're reading. And this doesn't necessarily have to be just a print article. It could be a video blog. It could be, chances are, if you're just looking at a blog, there are very few blogs that are just reporting. Most blogs are either analysis or opinions. Okay, so if you're following somebody's blog and you're getting information from their blog, just beware that they're not giving you straight facts. Most of the time, they are picking the facts that support their position and trying to make the case. Kind of article that sometimes looks real is satire. I love satire. Satirical writing is writing that's intended for humor, but it's written in a way that it looks like news. So one of my favorite examples is like the creation of fake reports. So this is from one of my favorite satire sites, Babylon Bee, and they have a headline that said, they're talking about the study that was released that said that calling a person a Nazi is the most effective way to dialogue with them. And they provide a nice little pie chart that says, what are the most effective ways of dialoguing with people? Okay, and 80% of the most effective way of communicating in a respectful way to people is by calling them a Nazi. And then you got using logic, which is this, appealing to emotion, pointing out logical fallacies, agreeing to disagree, listening to their perspective, gets this nice little tiny pie right here. But it says it's a study, and it cites Purdue University. It's like, oh, wow. So somebody who sees this could actually say, well, that's true. This study actually came out. If they don't know, the Babylon Bee is a satire site. They just make stuff up for humor. Okay? But they do it in a way that the headlines and the stories are crafted to look true. But everybody who reads if you look at the website itself, it says, we're a satire site. Okay? You don't believe literally what we're saying. Another favorite one of mine is The Onion. This is probably like the granddaddy of online satire sites. This is the headline from this morning. Compassionate Trump issues a full presidential pardon for Robert Mueller. Right, so if you didn't know this was satire, you'd be like, oh, great, Robert Mueller's not going to go to jail. And Donald Trump has a great quote here. This poor guy's been through hell and back. He's had dirt thrown in his name and been unfairly attacked on social media for what? He's a good, honorable man. That sounds like something Donald Trump would say about the guy who's been investigating him for the last 2 years. Right? It's satire. Right? Donald Trump did not pardon Robert Mueller. Robert Mueller did not need pardoning. Right? It's satire. It's humor. These are both meant to make points about stuff, right, in a humorous way. So the point here is saying, when we look at our social media and we look at our interchange with each other on social media, what we actually find is nobody wants to listen to anybody else. They just want to take ideas that they don't like and then call the people who disagree with them Nazis, right? Making a comment about social media, social interaction. This is making a sarcastic comment about Donald Trump, given the way that he's talked about Robert Mueller for the last 2 years. Sometimes it's hard to tell, and sometimes the fact checkers get it wrong. So, Facebook has this new thing over the last year or so, in which they take news stories, and you can go to and when you see a news story that comes up, there's a little information button that pops up, and you can learn more about that source. And so one of the things that they said is that there's this headline that came out that said CNN purchases industrialized-sized washing machine to spin the news before publication. Spin, means is to provide a slant on it, interpret it the way you want to interpret it. And so on its own, would you say this is a true story or is this satire? It's satire, but not everybody knows that. So Snopes.com actually had to put up an entry because this is not the way spin happens, right? Spin is an intellectual process of interpreting information. It's not washing machine, right? So Snopes said, did CNN purchase an industrialized washing machine to spin the news? Right? Unfortunately, they marked this as false. But Facebook algorithms are stupid, right? And so what actually happened is Babylon Bee posted this. Okay, my favorite satire site. They posted it. A guy I follow, Adam Ford, he reposted it from his business page. And he got a flag from Facebook and kind of got put in temporary Facebook jail because the page you admin, Babylon Bee, recently posted the link, CNN purchases, industrial life, that contains information disputed by Snopes.com because the way Facebook determines whether something is true or not is whether Snopes says it's okay. Snopes determined that this was false, and so they put him on Facebook jail for posting this satirical article that Snopes then had to debunk. Discernment, right? Use some judgment, some wisdom. Just the premise is just silly, right? So, questions? Okay. Now that we've looked at a variety of different kinds of articles, I think it's worth taking a few minutes to think about how we can choose the news that we're going to look at, choosing it carefully. First of all, I think that it's important that as much as possible that we get original news from an original source. So if you receive a Facebook link or a Twitter link that talks about a news story, don't just take the person who linked it, just don't take their word for it. Go to the original source to find out what the article actually said, because sometimes people unintentionally or sometimes intentionally will misinterpret what the original source said. Second thing is, if you're reading about something that seems like it's a crisis, look at that in multiple outlets. So don't just rely on a single outlet. And lots of research shows that any one particular media source tends to be somewhat biased and brings its own assumptions to the table. So I think it's important that we work with multiple sources from a liberal perspective, from a conservative perspective. If we're dealing with scientific issues, such as breaking news on COVID-19, as much as possible, rely on actual scientific sites. My wife, for example, rather than relying on news or mass media, tends to look at things from respected medical communities, such as the Centers for Disease Control and Johns Hopkins University, and sources like that that are more apt to provide a professional perspective on a particular topic. Third, it's important that when we're dealing with issues that come up very quickly, it could be a terrorist attack, or it could be a breaking news story, such as a new set of infections related to COVID-19. It could be related to anything that seems like it's happening, crisis in a moment. Keep in mind that in the real world, we learn facts slowly over a long period of time. So don't get too frightened or too fearful or too exercised about something that you see one time just for a few moments. Take your time, pace your consumption of media in a measured way over a day, over a couple of days, before getting too freaked out or too angry about it. It's important when we're looking at the media that we're consuming to finally separate facts from opinions. So as we talked about with the different kinds of articles, some are simply news articles. Sometimes those news articles get facts wrong. Sometimes they're true, but they contain misstatements inside them. But sometimes the articles that we're looking at appear to be written as factual when in fact they're opinions. They're supposed to be persuasive articles rather than actually being reporting articles. So it's important to maybe look at news sources that have some kind of a label on their publications that talk about the fact that distinguish between the kinds of things that they're publishing, such as reporting versus analysis versus opinions. This is also important to think about when we're looking at media online and in terms of cable news. For example, there are some news programs on all the major stations, Fox, MSNBC, CNN, that are news story. They're news programming. And their main purpose is to provide factual reporting. And I think, on balance, when it comes to factual reporting, that most of the major news sources do a reasonably good job. Of course, there's bias, and we can talk about that in a separate question, but most of the news reporting programs tend to be relatively straightforward. But where we tend to get things messed up is when we start to veer off into journalists expressing their opinions or providing some kind of an analysis that reveals their biases. And then it's even worse or more striking when we get to kind of the prime time programming on the major news networks. We look at shows like Tucker Carlson or shows like Rachel Maddow or Hardball, or other kinds of shows like this. It's important to recognize that these shows are not reporting. They are specifically designed to provide some level of analysis from a particular perspective and to persuade you and to keep you engaged and keep you angry about the topic they're talking about. Their goal in those shows is to maximize ratings, and ratings get maximized when people are fearful and have a sense of uncertainty and are afraid. So their role on those late night, those primetime shows on the major networks, their job is to keep you engaged and to keep you unsettled and frightened. Their job is not to report things objectively. So it's important to understand that. Finally, it's really tempting in our current environment to share news that we find credible. So if we see a headline that shows up, we want to, and a news story that we think is compelling and interesting, we want to spread it. We want to share it with people that we care about. The problem is that we have a propensity to spread news that might be false. And this is actually one of the things that we know that Russia has been involved in trying to exacerbate social conflicts in the United States, not just to help any particular person win an election, but to try to create uncertainty and social unrest and social conflict in the United States. So it's important that we verify the things that we're sharing, not just something that we think might be true. And gosh, we see all kinds of this with the COVID-19 uncertainty that we have. Lots of people spreading lots of information that has no scientific basis. Lots of rumors. Don't spread rumors. You're just making things worse. So I encourage you to look at, to take one key strategy. In addition to the things that we're talking about above, getting coverage of a story or a topic in multiple outlets. My wife shared something with me and she said, I hadn't heard this anywhere else. And I said, well, if nobody else is reporting it, it's probably something to be suspicious and be very cautious about sharing. So verify news by going to multiple sources and not acting in haste, evaluating the differences between facts and opinion. But I encourage you to use fact checkers online. Lots of local media, state media are trying to provide some kind of a basis for evaluating the claims and the statements that are made in public. So I think there are two in particular that I have found that are national level publications that I have found to be pretty reliable when it comes to fact checking. The first two are called factcheck.org and the second one is called PolitiFact. And I really like these two sources. They're based out of mass media and the University of Pennsylvania, but I have found them to be pretty reliable. They pick on or they critique the statements both of liberals, conservatives, Democrats, and Republicans. Of course, they do tend to spend more time talking about the current administration. So under the Obama administration, they spent more time criticizing the Obama statements. And now with Trump as the president, they're spending more time criticizing what Trump says because those people just get more publicity and have a much wider audience. So I encourage you to go like the Facebook pages of Fact Check and PolitiFact. I encourage you to listen to what they say and go to them as resources to evaluate the factual claims of things that you hear before you share it. Another pretty good site, but much less perfect, is Snopes. This is a really well-known fact checker website, and they have their place. So I think that they're pretty good about things like fact checking urban legends and kind of weird claims. I'm a bit suspicious of their politics. They do tend to be left-leaning in terms of the way that they interpret things. And so when it comes to political questions, I am much less likely to use Snopes because I think that they are not really unbiased. Whereas I think the Fact Check and PolitiFact also tend to be more fact-based, more unbiased, and more even-handed. Finally, I pulled some of those ideas on that previous slide from this really good video. It's about 5 or 6 minutes long. I encourage you to go take a look at this video, How to Choose Your News. Hopefully you can just search on that title and it should come up in YouTube pretty easily. And if it doesn't, you can freeze the video here and you can go type in that link on your own. So as we've covered over the last several minutes, media has historically played a key linkage role connecting politicians and the government with the people. And we've seen how Trump has really disrupted that pattern by taking his message directly to the people. We also identified 4 key types of articles, and it's important that you use the media cues that are available, but also your own good judgment to discern what kind of article you're reading and to measure your response accordingly. Finally, my wife shared with me the other day about how to get my own Bitmoji, and just for kicks, here's a picture of my own Bitmoji, and I hope that you've enjoyed this talk. If you have further questions, you can contact me here. Otherwise, be smart in your use of the media. Take care.